Patrik Laine is now a Montreal Canadien, but what does this mean for him, and what does it mean for the team? Saba of Locked On Canadiens is here to dig deeper into the Laine trade. We've got that and a lot more next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Montreal Canadiens, Saba. And Laura, not a dull moment around the Habs these days. Patrik Laine, the big story. Let's start with this. What was the reaction in Montreal by the team with this acquisition?
So it was a little bit of a surprise in that we had heard in the media that there wasn't really any interest from Montreal in Laine, but there was enough talk where you felt that where there's smoke, there's fire. It was a pretty big deal in that the Canadiens had been working on this for a few days, but nobody had reported anything, and few of us had any idea until Elliot Friedman was like, "Oh, you know what? There's traction on this deal." And I was like, "Is it traction enough for me to change my weekend plans, or sorry, my evening plans, or is it traction where we're going to be talking about this for 2 weeks and nothing's going to materialize, right?" But it turns out that the Canadiens had been working the phones. They've been doing a lot of research. There had been a lot of back and forth with Columbus. Columbus had given them unprecedented access to his medical records and other people to talk to. So when it did happen, every August, Kent Hughes does a big thing, whether it's making a trade or being, the third team in a trade and really benefiting Montreal. In this case, he said himself that this was a reward. The guys had worked so hard last year. This, acquiring a player of this caliber was a reward for the team.
So the reward is Patrik Laine. Where does he fit in to the Montreal lineup? Who are his potential line mates?
So, everybody has him penciled into the second line simply because that first line of Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki, Juraj Slafkovsky is working so well. It does feel like somebody like a Kirby Dach can bring out the best in him. He talks about being a playmaker, but I think, the biggest aspect of his game is finishing. It is scoring goals. Kirby Dach is the kind of person who can create space on the ice for you. And so it does seem natural that he would benefit from that. And then Alex Newhook just seems to be the guy that's there. It does seem that, I always feel so hard on Alex Newhook, but it's just there's these other names a lot of the times have a lot more pizzazz attached to them. And poor Alex Newhook has worked really, really hard. He's a good player. It's just that I always, I get so excited about the Juraj Slafkovskys and the Kirby Dachs of the team. But that seems to be kind of initially where he'll go. There's a lot of possibility, a very strong possibility he does end up on that first line, right? The Canadiens want a lot of offense. They don't just want one line. They want to roll lines. So I think he slots, obviously he's going to be in the top 6. Whether he's top 3 or top 6 remains to be seen, but I don't see him not playing on that second line to start.
How about the power play? He's got to find a place on either the first or second unit, I would think.
Absolutely. And there's this very, very, I think for me, another exciting thing about this is that Kirby Dach coming back and him being here gives the Canadiens 2 legitimate power play waves. 2 legitimate, right? And before it was their first wave would be on for almost 2 minutes, and then somebody would come in the cleanup seconds of the power play. So this really gives them a lot of depth, and this really gives them a 1-2 punch where really they didn't have.
Who do you think on the Canadiens roster benefits most from this trade, and who do you think will be, losing some ice time as a result of this deal?
I think this definitely leaves Josh Anderson out in the cold. Really, his only saving grace on this team right now is the fact that it's a contract nobody wants to trade for, right? So the Canadiens have no choice but to try to make something work with him. Although my co-host did float the possibility of sending him down to Laval in an episode earlier this week. But I think really a person who you would think doesn't benefit, like you would think that this kind of hurts them, is Joshua Roy because of his emergence last season. But one of our listeners pointed out, and the more I think about it, the more I find that this is very astute, is that he no longer has that pressure to actually be a legitimate second line guy, right? He can just hang out on the third line and prove himself, and then he gets slotted into wherever becomes an opportunity for him. He gets to prove that he's a legitimate NHLer without the expectation of all of the hype of the past 3 years following him around the ice, because now everybody's going to be focused on Patrik Laine.
Laine, as we know, has had some issues off the ice. What, if anything, do you think the Canadiens are going to do to support him? And are there any players who you think will be particularly supportive of him emotionally?
I think the big thing with Patrik Laine is that Kent Hughes was very, very specific in his press conference after the trade. And Laine also alluded to that as well. And when he was available afterwards for the media, is that he wanted to play in a big market like Montreal, right? He wanted that, like he kept talking about Canadian hockey fans. He wanted a big market team. He seems to feel that he can play his best under that kind of spotlight. But at the same time, the Montreal Canadiens as an organization have come so far in the last 3 years, not even 2.5 years, with Jeff Borton at the helm and Kent Hughes as a general manager, is that they've cared a lot more about players' well-being in general. Like, it has been a significant shift. So I think the Canadiens are prepared to support him in whatever way they can. Particularly, they're very, very driven with initiatives and things like that and supporting their players. I also think Nick Suzuki's probably going to be one of the top people that reaches out to him, is there for him. I feel like he would feel a bit of a kinship with David Savard because of the Columbus connection, and Savard just seems like that guy. He seems like the dad, right? Like, he seems like that guy who would, and Mike Matheson too. I think Mike Matheson has very underrated leadership qualities, and he does seem kind of like the adult in the room, partly because he is one of the adults in the room. There's a bunch of kids there, and there's very, very few guys that are over, 25. But I think those will really be the players that kind of reach out to him. And the flip side of that is that I think he can be beneficial to players like Josh Anderson, who's been really down on himself and hard on himself, and his game has really, really suffered in the last year or so. And Patrik Laine might have some experience to lend with that. And by all accounts, he's always the one cracking jokes in the locker room. Even his press conference was hilarious. There's a lot of like little, sarcastic little quips and stuff like that. Like, I feel like he's going to be a guy that they're going to really like being around and having around. And I feel like he's going to return that in kind.
How about Jordan Harris? He goes back the other way. What does this trade do for him? I
think it is a true opportunity for him. Because on the Montreal Canadiens, there's a massive logjam at defense. There has been, there were 3 players exactly like that, right? Jaden Struble, Kovacevic, and Jordan Harris. Now, 2 of them are gone, which does pave way for other people. But I think on the Canadiens, Jordan Harris was never going to have the chance to be anything more than a third pairing defenseman, right? But I think that he has a really, really strong potential to be your top 4D, right? Like your number 4D. So playing on the second line with somebody a little bit more offensive and risky, et cetera, et cetera. Jordan Harris could reach his potential of being a second pair defenseman. I really wish that for him. I hope that for him. And I think Columbus will give him that opportunity because he's a steadying hand. He's the kind of player that does everything right on the ice, but he's not remarkable in any way. And you really need that if you're going to be a good defense, right? So if they put him on a second line, I'm never going to say he's going to be your top 2, right? Like he's not that. But if they put him in that top 4 spot, on that second pairing, it does give them the ability to have a defensive presence, like somebody who's really, really sound defensively, really good at getting the puck out of the zone or keeping the puck out of your own zone, and that frees somebody else up. He's good at the transition, so that allows some freedom for somebody more creative and more offensive to play alongside him on that second pair.
How does this trade change expectations for the Canadiens this year?
I think, with Kent Hughes saying this is a reward for the guys, right? I think this means that he wants to give them a shot at making the playoffs. I think that's what he wants for them. So it really does. And you're seeing it everywhere in all the media, all the analysis of this trade is, with Patrik Laine, they're a playoff team. Well, you know what? He's not the only player on this team. There's a bunch of other players on this team. So if there are no injuries, then I think that anything less than a wild card spot would be a disappointment this year.
All right. Well, I know you'll keep track of it all year long. Laura, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
So we are Locked On Canadiens. You'll find us anywhere you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube, just like Locked On NHL. You'll find me on Twitter at The Active Stick. You'll find my co-host at Maybe It's Ian. If you're a Habs fan, or even if you're not, check out our podcast. It's been really fun. I recently had a co-host change. It's been really fun. And we're gonna be talking about Patrik Laine all the time now. So check it out.
All right, Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.